The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on the agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly onpoli podcast. Here we are all these years later, and it feels like we've taken steps back. Governments have got to get over the notion that somehow we can't handle the truth. Partner, I know you're sitting there thinking to yourself, Steve, the Leafs are out of the playoffs. Why are you still wearing your Leaf jersey? And the answer is because this is no ordinary Leaf jersey. This is my Ron Ellis Leaf jersey. And Ron, as some may know, was my all-time favorite player for the Toronto Maple Leafs growing up. I met him for the first time when I was 10 years old, and it was one of those just unbelievably wonderful things where you meet your athletic hero, and he turns out to be the greatest mensch you can imagine.
Wonderful.
And then you become friends. And we did become friends over the years, which is truly one of the great joys of my life. And Ron, as everyone knows, died last weekend at the age of 79. I wrote a little column about him on the TVO website, tvo.org, and I am wearing his number 6 today to pay honor and tribute to him. Rest in peace, Ron Ellis. And I don't know what team that is, but it's not the Leafs, and I don't know what it is. Go ahead. What are you wearing?
Although there is at least a little bit of a childhood connection here in the sense that when I was very young, and this is something my wife discovered about me very late in our relationship, became a big nerd for Godzilla movies, and when she discovered this, she was kind of stunned, but she rolls with it now and understands that I'm a big fan of Godzilla movies. And so she bought me this shirt a while back. And so it is festooned with various, Godzillas and Rodans and Mothras and all of the monsters of the great Godzilla universe. And I was wearing this shirt last weekend, and somebody stopped me. I was downtown Toronto, and they said, "That's a great T-shirt. Actually, are you John Michael McGrath?" So apparently I've built a bit of a personal brand based on silly T-shirts in this podcast.
And that is certainly one.
Yes,
there we go.
Absolutely.
And with that, everybody, let's go on to issue 1.
Pursuant to Standing Order 77A, that the... They're all cowards! Order!
Well, that was the scene in the legislature earlier this week as New Democrat MPPs began to shout down progressive Conservative MPPs during a vote. The issue was over something called Lydias Law, which the NDP has been championing as a solution to what they see as a lack of justice on sexual assault charges. The bill, Lydias Law, was sent straight to a committee for further review, bypassing debate in the House, which the NDP did not appreciate. Okay, let's start with the private member's bill itself. Why don't you take us through some of the provisions of it?
Right. So this is a bill introduced by New Democrat MPP Catherine Fife called Lydias Law. As you might guess, it is named after a woman, Lydia, who is a survivor of sexual assault and had to wait almost 2 years to see justice in a provincial court because of associated court delays. The bill grew from recommendations made by the Auditor General in 2019. That audit, this is one of the value for many audits that the AG produces pretty regularly. This was looking at very lengthy delays in cases in provincial courts. Just for clarity here, we're talking about courts where the provincial government appoints judges, not superior courts where the judges are appointed by the Prime Minister and the federal government. So the bill introduced by Catherine Fife called on the Attorney General to report each year on the number of criminal cases that have been held up for more than 8 months. Provincial courts hear the vast majority of criminal cases in Ontario. The bill would also have the Attorney General's office dig into the reasons for delays, and it was supposed to be debated on Wednesday afternoon, but the government decided to skip that and send it straight to committee without any kind of debate.
And if you listen hard to the clip that we played right off the top, you can hear the words cowards being shouted from the NDP side to the Progressive Conservative side. Catherine Fife spoke to reporters after the vote. She was choking back tears at the time. And why don't you I don't know. Take us through some of the reaction to all of this.
Right. So this is something we've seen the government do before. They did something similar to a private member's bill from Mike Schreiner earlier this year. They just send the bill straight to committee without debate. Back then, Schreiner also did not think he was being particularly well treated by the government. And the issue here is not so much that the bill is getting sent to committee, because that would have happened if the bill had passed anyway. It's that the government used the shortcut to eliminate the step where MPPs debate and vote on the bill in the House. If there had been that debate, MPPs would have been able to speak on the matter. They would have, been able to give speeches, and they would have gotten government MPPs on the record voting for or against the bill. They did not get the opportunity to do that because of this legislative shortcut, if you want to put it that way. On X, formerly Twitter, NDP leader Marit Stiles called the decision despicable.
The minister in charge of this file for the Progressive Conservative government is Paul Calandra. What's his view on all of what's gone on?
Well, he is, of course, the government House leader, as well as being the Minister of Municipal Affairs, so wears a few different hats here. But in this case, it's government House leader, and he was accusing the NDP of putting on a show, so to speak. He said, the goal was to actually speed up the consideration of the measures that were recommended in Fife's bill, because the Committee on Justice Policy is already considering what to do about broadly speaking, intimate partner violence and issues like that, and reforms needed for the justice system. He has said to reporters that he believes parts of Fife's bill could be folded into an eventual report from the committee and could become law through government legislation. NDP leader Marit Stiles did say in question period on Wednesday that nobody is buying that, which I think is the closest you can come in the House to calling the government House leader a liar. The good news, such as it is, though, is that when the government, if the government does bring forward a new piece of legislation, whether that's court reform generally or specifically tailored to intimate partner violence, we will be able to see in the text of that bill whether it has incorporated anything from what Fife was recommending.
Right. And just to put a little context around this, we're not talking about a few cases that have been delayed over the years. Catherine Fife brought forward statistics which showed we are talking thousands of cases, thousands, where the justice system has apparently broken down and not worked to see a timely delivery of cases, and therefore people are walking away free without those charges being tested in court.
Right, and this is in part as a result of a Supreme Court decision from the last decade, the Jordan decision, which really reasserted the importance, and it's spelled out in the charter. It's not like the Supreme Court made this up, that people have a right to a timely trial, and the Supreme Court really, put some rigor to that rule, and not just Ontario, provinces all over Canada are still dealing with how to expand their court systems and make the justice system flow more efficiently, so that hopefully you see fewer cases that are tossed simply for literally in some cases a lack of a courtroom and a judge to hear them.
Right. And with that, we're on to issue 2. Health Minister Sylvia Jones said something this week that raised a lot of eyebrows. She said Ontario doesn't have a doctor shortage. And to buttress her case, she pointed out that the supply of doctors in the province has gone up over the last several years in numbers greater than the general population has increased. Now, that may be true, but opposition leader Marit Stiles suggested it was cold comfort to the perhaps 2 million Ontarians who still don't have a family doctor. And let's keep in mind that the comments were made in the midst of negotiations between the province and the Ontario Medical Association, so perhaps we can understand why the minister wants to tamp down the notion of a doctor shortage, because, of course, she wants as inexpensive a settlement as possible. Regardless, JMM, how advisable do you think those comments were?
Well, I mean, you already mentioned the 2 million Ontarians who lack a family doctor. So certainly any one of those 2 million people could say maybe they would disagree. And, we can also point to things like emergency rooms around rural Ontario in particular, where we've seen shortened hours, or just in some cases they've been closed entirely for a lack of doctors or other health workers. Or we could talk about this from the other direction, right? The government seems to believe very much that there is a doctor shortage in Ontario. And the reason I say that is because they have done things like worked with the College of Physicians and Surgeons to expedite the credentialing of doctors trained outside of Canada. There's something that both the government and the college had sort of dragged their feet on for many years. And after COVID, they suddenly discovered, like, oh gosh, there's all these people living in Ontario who are credentialed doctors who maybe we should get them working here.
not to mention the creation of new medical schools, which are coming as well to the province.
Well, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So I think any way you look at it, the government actually does know that there is a doctor shortage. As you say, we can sort of guess as to why the Minister of Health would say that the shortage is not as severe, or maybe that she would like to believe it doesn't exist. But in the context of these negotiations, I don't think it made the government look very good. It makes it look like they don't know what's going on.
Well, and doctor shortages are not the only problem in the healthcare system as it relates to shortages. You got some more for us?
I do indeed. The Canadian Press reported this week that the government's own briefing documents are forecasting some pretty severe shortages for nurses and PSWs in long-term care. A shortage of 33,000 nurses and 50,000 more PSWs will be needed in less than a decade.
Not meant to be a smart aleck question, but how do we know that?
Not a smart aleck question, because that's part of the story. How these numbers came out and how we get to talk now about the terrible state of Canadian access to information laws. Bit of a hard turn here, but we're going to make it. In this case, Global News had requested these numbers after a 2022 request under Ontario's Freedom of Information law. The government had redacted those numbers. Global appealed, but was denied.
Well, but you just read the numbers, so obviously you know them, we know them. How do we know them?
Because separately, Canadian Press had filed a different FOI to the Ministry of Long-Term Care, and those numbers were released without redaction.
Oh, hilarious. Talk about left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing.
Absolutely, right? And so when I say this next bit, I'm going to get on a bit of a soapbox here, but I really want to emphasize that this is not a partisan point or even a provincial one. It is that governments across this country are just absolutely god-awful terrible on the basic matter of letting the public know what it has a right to know. Our laws are bad. The implementation of the laws, as we see in this case, is bad. And even when candidates are elected on clear promises to improve access to information, as Justin Trudeau was in 2015, the reality is that our systems keep getting worse and worse. It ought to be a scandal in this country, but it is, regrettably, it is kind of like the weather. At this point, nobody really does anything about that. And with that, I'm going to take a breath and I'm going to get off of my soapbox.
No, I don't mind you up there on that soapbox. You stay up there because we are entitled to this information. I well remember it was 1985 when David Peterson was the premier, along with support from Bob Rae, the then NDP leader. They passed the first ever Freedom of Information law in the province of Ontario, and everybody thought it was a pretty cool thing at the time that we were finally, in 1985, doing something that not very many other jurisdictions in the world were doing. And here we are all these years later, and it feels like we've taken steps back. Governments have got to get over the notion that somehow we can't handle the truth, right? I mean, that's just not the case. We're not Jack Nicholson from a Few Good Men. We can handle the truth, and we want the truth. Anyway, should I get off my soapbox now?
Yes, let us both get off our soapboxes together, and we can move on.
And on to issue 3. Ontario, and particularly the Greater Toronto Area, have been rocked by a wave of car thefts in the past year, and the government has announced new measures this week to help combat this problem. Convicted car thieves could see their driver's licenses suspended, potentially for their entire lives. Okay, we got to hear more on this. Go ahead.
So the government is introducing a bill that would, if passed, let the Ministry of Transportation suspend people's driver's licenses if they are convicted of specific crimes. And so if you want to imagine how this is going to work, you would be in court prosecuted for a federal crime, like, we'll get into which crimes in a moment. And then, at the time of your trial, the Crown prosecutor would say, and also we're going to take your license for a period of time. There is already language in the Highway Traffic Act that allows this for other crimes, but not auto theft, at least not at the moment. The government would now extend that language to auto thefts, and the penalties would actually be more severe. On a first offense, car thieves could lose their license for 10 years. On a second, 15 years. And if they get a third strike or more, they could lose their license indefinitely. Then on Wednesday, the government announced it would also be increasing the penalties for drunk driving, including the potentially requiring people to install ignition interlock devices. These are things you blow in and it either if you test positive for alcohol, your car will not start. And so these have been around forever. This would allow the province to more easily require them. And the government is also proposing to stiffen the penalties for stunt driving, though in that case, if I'm reading the government's announcements correctly, it is more comparable to the way other crimes are already treated in the Highway Traffic Act.
Well, let's follow up on that for a bit. What other alleged crimes can people lose their driver's licenses for?
Right. So you won't necessarily have your license suspended for all of these, but many of them are what you would think, right? Drunk driving, refusing an alcohol test, fleeing the scene of an accident, dangerous driving, causing bodily harm or death. These can all already see your license suspended. Also, while I was researching this, I stumbled across the fact that you can have your license suspended for treason or mutiny, which delights me for some reason.
Did not know that. That's a new one. Okay, good.
But one question I've got, and we haven't seen the legislation's full text yet as we record this, but it sounds like the penalties for auto theft could actually end up being stiffer than the penalties for killing someone, at least if alcohol isn't involved.
Well, that's potentially, I can see a civil rights lawyer doing something with that.
Right. And so, the first person who has their license suspended under this law is very likely to launch a charter challenge. We've seen it before when, for example, the federal government strengthened drunk driving rules. One of the things courts will look at is whether the penalties the government imposes are proportional to the problem they are trying to solve. And I don't know necessarily, again, I will say again, I am not a lawyer, but this kind of disjuncture between a penalty for drunk driving or a penalty for auto theft versus a penalty for killing somebody, the court could say, actually, this makes no sense, and these penalties don't pass charter muster because of that. Now, I mean, nobody is arguing here that car theft or drunk driving certainly are not valid problems for the provincial government to try to suppress, but I am curious about whether the courts will look at the disparity here and have something to say.
Indeed. And now, on to the stuff we wrote this week. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the stuff we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. And JMM, what do you got teed up this week?
Well, my column this week is about Bonnie Crombie trying to out-populist Doug Ford.
I like that piece, actually. And this is, let's go a little back and forth on this, because I think this is a really fascinating topic. Here's, I think, the basic 411. The Liberals had a press conference. They unveiled a new policy proposal to reduce Ontario's small business tax rate from 3.2% to 1.6%, and to increase the threshold from $500,000 to $600,000, more generous for small businesses. Crombie says the move would benefit nearly 300,000 small businesses in the province, and you were down there at Queen's Park for the announcement, so what'd you think?
Well, I'm going to start off by saying I don't take a specific tax proposal from the third party at the legislature 2 years before the next election terribly seriously in itself. There's just so much time between now and then. I don't think we can necessarily expect Crombie to actually absolutely be nailed to the details of a specific policy. That said, what I found more interesting than the proposal itself was how Crombie presented it. Most obviously, I think, is that she really wants people to understand that the Liberals want to cut taxes. She said that repeatedly. The Liberals are tax cutters. And I think that's a really interesting turn, especially when you consider who the last Liberal premier was and what her government did in power.
I agree. That's the first place my head went when I heard this announcement, and I'm fascinated by the political decision of the Liberals to essentially decide to fight Doug Ford and his government on the issue of tax cuts. I think it's fair to say that since 1990, Premier Mike Harris, well, he wasn't the premier yet, he was the leader of the third place party, but Mike Harris ran as the tax fighter, and pretty much nonstop since then, so what are we talking now, 34 years, the PC Party of Ontario has sort of positioned itself as the Keep Taxes Low party, while the Liberals, first under David Peterson in 1985, then under Dalton McGuinty in 2003, Kathleen Wynne in 2013, have kind of been the tax more so we can improve your public services party. And this is an attempt for the Liberals, I think, to compete with the PCs on what essentially has been pretty much Tory turf for 3 decades, and I find that an interesting choice. Can the Liberals, under Crombie, rebrand to be less of a tax and spend party, or will the public think, if I want lower taxes, I'm going to vote for the Conservatives? Why? I mean, they've demonstrated over decades their bona fides on this. why wouldn't I stick with them? Anyway, it's an interesting place to play ball, and we'll see how it works out.
Right. And, when Crombie launched her leadership campaign, she said that she thought that the party should move to the right of where it had been. I think this is sort of an example of what that looks like in the real world. And, one of the things that I really want to underline here is that it's not just tax cutting, that the Crombie is really trying to strike a more populist tone here. When I asked, how much will this tax change that you are proposing cost, she had a very specific answer. It would cost as much as the Ontario Place parking lot that this government is paying for. Now, it's a bit more complicated than that, of course, because this would cost about $500 million every year, and you presumably only have to build that parking lot once. But, she also would later say to me that you could also compare the cost to how much the Ontario government is spending on agency nurses. We've talked about that issue before on the podcast. So, I think our audience can keep this in mind over the next 2 years as we watch the Liberals and Tories try to define each other in advance of the next election, right? The Tories have tried very hard to define Crombie as the quote-unquote queen of the carbon tax. And now we see this week how Crombie is responding in kind. And, we will watch how this plays out in months and years to come.
It is the perpetual campaign now, isn't it?
Yes,
Campaigns
absolutely.
never end. That is true.
How about yourself?
Well, let's start with this. Elanor Kaplan turns 80 on Monday. And that seems to me as good a reason as any to try to do a story on Elanor Kaplan and how she's doing. And who is Elanor Kaplan? Some of our younger viewers and listeners may be asking. Well, I'm glad you asked, because if you're into onpoli, there she is. I took that picture just a few days ago, actually. She's someone you need to know about. First of all, Elanor Kaplan served at all three levels of government. Not many people in politics do that. She was a North York City councillor. She was a Liberal MPP and cabinet minister under David Peterson. And then she was a federal MP and cabinet minister under Jean Chrétien, all three levels. When she was the health minister in David Peterson's government in the late 1980s, she maybe made one of the biggest splashes that any health minister has ever made. You may remember the Supreme Court of Canada weighed in on Canada's abortion law at the time and ruled it unconstitutional. They threw it out. Now, as you might imagine, provincial health ministers, attorneys general, lots of people all over the country were figuring out at that time, including in the federal scene, what are we going to do here? Do we use the notwithstanding clause to overturn this court decision? Do we accept the decision? Do we try to pass a new law? What do we do? As soon as the ruling came out, Elanor Kaplan held a scrum with reporters outside her office, and she said, "We respect the court's decision. I'm pro-choice. We're moving on." Period. Full stop. That was it. And she freelanced that. Didn't consult anybody else in government. She just did it. And Premier Peterson went up to her after the fact and said, "Elanor, don't you think you should have consulted with me first on that before just going out there and freelancing government policy?" And her answer was, "Nope. That was my personal belief. I always figured you could fire me if you wanted to, but that's where I wanted to plant my flag, and there you go." Now, regardless of your position on abortion, that's a pretty gutsy thing to do.
And way to spend the political capital that you have.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely. Now, one of her proudest moments, many years later, her son David Kaplan was also elected to the Ontario legislature and also became health minister. So you can imagine, it was in Dalton McGuinty's government, you could imagine the pride Elanor felt in her son following in her footsteps. Now, here's where it gets hard. I wish I could say that this family affair story had a happy ending, but for those who do remember, it does not. David died 5 years ago under very, very curious circumstances. He was only 54 years old. There was an explosion in his home. He died from his injuries sustained in that. Eleanor's husband, Wilf Kaplan, died just earlier this year as well. So these last few years have been particularly difficult for her. She is a wonderful person. She is a strong person. I was at a dinner a few days ago and saw her then, and of course spoke to her a few weeks ago for this column that I'm talking about right now. And she was in good shape, in fine form, amongst her friends. So happy 80th birthday, Elanor Kaplan, one of the good people in politics at North York City Hall, at Queen's Park, and on Parliament Hill. There we go. Now, just before we go to the mailbag, this is usually the part of the pod where we like to give a few shout-outs.
Yes.
So let me do some of that here. Earlier this week, I'm at the downtown campus at the University of Toronto, and a guy named Jacob Nicholas stops me on the street, and we get into a conversation. He tells me he's about to go to law school at the University of Ottawa, and he says he's a regular listener to the podcast. And I told him, you can't just listen, you got to watch us on TV too. So always love to hear that the younger kids are getting into onpoli and watching us. So Jacob, good luck to you at law school. Then I bumped into a couple named Bob and Gail Berberick, who said, "We like you and that other nerd." We like you and that other nerd. That was great. And finally, one more. Sheldon, can you put this picture up? I shot this backstage over the weekend. This guy's name is Dean Yates. He's a trombone player. Now, I'm on stage last weekend in Hamilton hosting a 40th anniversary celebration for the Hamilton All-Star Jazz Band, which my dad has been a volunteer for years. And as I am introducing the band, and as the members of the band are walking out on stage, Dean walks right up to me, leans over to me and says, "I love the podcast." Now, there are lots of things that I thought a jazz trombonist would say to me as he walked towards me on stage, but "I love the podcast" was not on my top 10 list. So I thought that was pretty cool, too.
That's lovely. I also want to give a shout out to Peter Constantino, who is the academic director of the Ontario Legislative Intern Program. And he stopped me in the basement of the legislature this week when I was there on Tuesday. It was very complimentary about the podcast, and he says he recommends it to the students who take part in the intern program at Queen's Park.
Awesome.
And we are, after all, the educational broadcasters, so there's not much that I could hear that would make me happier than that. So thank you, Peter, and just really lovely to hear that.
That's sweet.
With that, let's go to the mailbag.
And we remind you, if you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love getting them at onpolitics@tvo.org. And we throw it over to JMM to read the first letter.
This week's letter is from Anthony Silva. Greetings, gents. Longtime follower /viewer /listener. Here's my question. How much does it cost Ontarians to conduct a provincial election? And in the year 2024, how is it possible that we still don't have the option to vote online? I would think voter engagement would be escalated and costs would be massively decreased. Thanks. By the way, Steve, my dad, RIP, was a huge Bill Davis fan too. Anthony.
Anthony, your father obviously had very good judgment. That's nice. All right, let me tackle the online voting angle first. And I have to say, I'm very torn on this issue. I have heard lots of great arguments on all sides of this thing. I've always started from the position that there is something really quite special about Election Day. And I know we have lots of advance polls. I never vote in the advance polls, ever. Same for you.
Yeah. I go on voting day.
Something special about Election Day. Never mind that it gives you the opportunity to hear all the information right up to the last minute before you make your decision. But there's something kind of cool about standing in line with your fellow citizens, waiting to get checked in, taking the ballot, going to the ballot booth, putting the X on the piece of paper. I think that's kind of a neat shared experience by citizens. I like that. I do think it's an issue that we have our elections on days of the week where lots of people work, and therefore sometimes tough to get a time off work. I know the employer is supposed to give you time off work, but doesn't always happen. If we had elections on the weekends, might be easier to get more people out to the polls. Maybe we'd have better turnout, so that's a possibility. However, Anthony, I do take your point about online. It is 2024. People can do their banking online. That's pretty secretive stuff. Doctors can send x-rays of, your body parts to each other online. That's also, pretty private stuff. I appreciate the fact that for older people or for people with disabilities, voting online would be a lot more convenient than having to schlep out to the polls. So where am I after all of that? Right where I started. I don't know. I'm of two minds. How about you?
Online voting wouldn't be the first reform I would look for. You mentioned voting on weekends. I've always thought different people have different holy days, and I think the idea of doing voting Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then we announce the results Monday morning. I feel like that would be pretty clean, pretty easy, but nobody's asked me. Now, municipally, Ontario does actually allow town and city councils to implement online voting, and the results aren't a home run. Last week, we mentioned the dismal turnout in Black River Matheson's last election.
What was it, 6% or something?
Yeah, something like that. It was a very specific situation. There weren't a lot of contested elections, but online voting was an option there, and it didn't save them from low turnout, is my point. In 2022, CBC actually did an analysis of Ontario municipalities because it's now been several election cycles where online voting has been an option. And they found a consistent pattern of, an initial boost to turnout when online voting first became possible, followed by a return to the norm. The norm for municipal elections, anyway, being pretty low turnout. Now, it's possible things would be different provincially, but I think let me say, skepticism is warranted.
Now, Anthony also asked about the cost of holding a provincial general election in 124 different ridings across Ontario. What do you know?
This is an easy question to answer because Elections Ontario is required to produce a post-election report, and the 2022 election cost $158,706,922 to administer, and that includes the campaign election subsidies to political parties.
You've got to say that number again. It cost how much?
$158,706,922.
That is a lot of money.
It is. It is a lot of money. And that number will almost certainly be larger in 2026 because we are likely to have more than 124 ridings next time.
Right.
The Federal House of Commons has already adopted a new riding map nationally for the next national election. And for a generation now, Ontario's practice has been that we adopt the federal map for Southern Ontario while keeping the number of northern seats the same. So if I have my numbers right, we should actually have 125 MPPs after the next election. Now, the catch here is that Ontario isn't actually required to follow the federal map. Constitutionally, Ontario can adopt its own map if it wants. We're just sort of assuming for planning purposes, because it has been the practice for the last 20 some odd years, that they will just adopt the federal map for Southern Ontario until we hear otherwise from the government.
Right on. Okay, kiddo, give the email address again.
Absolutely. Again, if you would like to ask us about content for the show or on the show, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the onpoli podcast for this May 17th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org, and be sure to include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Tiff Lamb, video editing by Ian Partridge.
Production support from Ariana Longley, Jonathan Hallowell, Christine Gardner, Carla Lucetta, and Vito Tagarelli.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks, as always, to our studio crew for making the show look so darn good and making this video podcast happen. Absolutely. And with that, we say until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
When you are advising a client on how to deliver a message to the media, or when you yourself were in politics as an MPP and doing a press conference, for example, what's the key piece of information that you either send people out or got sent out that you think is helpful to them as they negotiate those rough waters of a news conference?
So probably 4 fast things off the top. It's not about the surly reporter. It's about the audience and keep them in mind. It is all about the space and time you have to fill and about the headline these days because we're all scrolling through millions of them. So get to that headline right away. And if you are asked an unwanted question, then address it briefly and get back to the job at hand, which is filling that space and time with what you came to tell people.
Will, how does that sound to you?
I mean, it's relevant, right? It's bang on. I think, what we're talking about here is a policy announcement. And I think at that point, it depends on what the policy is, right? If it's heavily controversial, you're sending your minister out with different advice. But on a regular funding announcement like this, that, led to your article on this in this space, it's really about reminding them to communicate effectively, to communicate directly, to be human. I worked for a politician that was very excitable. So one of my last pieces of advice for him was always calm down. Think of you're talking to your grandmother. Get focused on that image in your head so you can communicate to that grandmother on the other side of the television camera.
Who is the politician?
John Baird. Yeah.
John Baird.
Very excitable. I think I could say that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Aaron, what would you add to that so far?
One of the last things I tell politicians right before a news conference is, what's our tone today? What's the tone we're going out with? Are we excited? Are we calm? Are we worried? Are we scared? How do people feel? And can you reflect back their feelings towards them? If they know the topic at hand, if they know how to answer the questions, then that should be on their mind going out. What's my tone?
When you are at a press conference at Queen's Park and you ask a question, or anybody does for that matter, and the minister is obviously skating, obfuscating, trying really hard to, what Jennifer suggested, be responsive and then pivot to something else. What are you thinking at that moment?
Can I shake them off it, or am I not going to be able to? And with some ministers, you know, you have no hope. Like, I'll give an example, name names if that's
sure.
Okay. The finance minister, Peter Bethlenfalvy, he's very hard to shake. So when he does the same thing that Minister Dunlop did and take your question and answer something else, you're not going to get him off it. But he also doesn't look scared or uncertain. He does it with authority, and you just sort of give up and move on.
Well, okay, you've just referenced Minister Dunlop, and that's what I presume you were referring to, Will, in your first answer. So that's a bit of the inspiration for this program here, is that several weeks ago, the Colleges and Universities Minister Jill Dunlop, who, let me say for the record, is a lovely person, is a good person, but who went into the media studio that day and did not have a great day. Here was the first question that she was asked and her response. Sheldon, please.
Yes or no, do you disagree with the federal government's decision to cap international students?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And absolutely, the decision was made by the federal government. It was a unilateral decision with absolutely no consultation with the provinces or the sector.
That's not an answer.
Now, reporters don't, I have to say, I don't think we usually do that, where we actually say to the minister in question, that's not an answer. That's a little cheeky. But okay, Jennifer, you're advising the minister in that case, let's say, and she gives what is quite obviously a completely unresponsive answer to the question. What's your advice at that point?
Advice to the minister for having given that answer?
Exactly.
It's a little hard to advise them when they're live in the situation, right? So they're on their own. Once they're up there, they're on their own. But the reason why they do it is because so often it works. And that was the point that was just made, is that sometimes they give up. If you just doggedly continue to stick to that message. Going back to the other point that was made about policy is really, if you're bringing your communications team in early in the policy development, then you're going to actually troubleshoot a lot of these policy issues or funding announcement issues by having your team in place and saying, you know what, you might want to modify something and you'll end up with a better policy and a better rollout. But sometimes you do have to really try to address the question, albeit briefly, because often it's an opposition agenda question maybe that's being put to you, and you don't want to engage in the opposition agenda for your few seconds of fame there. Mm-hmm. So just address it, have a way to address that question meaningfully and move on quickly back to what you want to say.
Yeah, Will, let me follow up with you on that. I mean, it was pretty obvious that she was coached, that if you are asked A, B, and C, make sure you don't answer A, B, and C, just pivot to X, Y, and Z. Yeah. Now, is that useful advice to give a minister?
So look, I'll answer that two ways. One, I think anytime you're doing any type of public communications, you need to sound like a human. You need to be relatable. You need to be approachable, and it helps if you have some empathy. You know, I think that's one piece of it. The other piece of it is, though, frankly, she probably has been coached. The minister has been coached. I mean, I do this type of coaching. And it's also a product of the way in which this press conference will be covered. Knowing full well that whatever she says is going to be clipped for the evening news at about 10 seconds. So if she just keeps saying the same thing over and over again, she knows what's going to be on the clip that evening. There's very few long-form public policy shows like The Agenda where you can actually have that fulsome discussion about all of the back and forth. That doesn't make it right, but I can see how you get to that point in the minister's, to give the minister a little bit of defense here.
I want to start by having our director, Sheldon Osmond, bring up some numbers here that really tell a very big story. This is the economic impact of film and television in the province of Ontario. And if we go back to 2021, right in the thick of COVID, we were still doing almost $3 billion of business here in the province. The following year, it actually went up a bit to $3.2 billion. But then came the strike, 2023, and business really fell. $1.8 billion annually. That is a big drop-off, and Marguerite, perhaps we could have you start by telling us, those are the numbers, but what does it look like on the ground when you see that kind of drop?
Those numbers are really real. It definitely, what we're seeing is that coming out of the strike, less production is being commissioned. So there's definitely a downturn. We're feeling that in terms of fewer productions in Toronto. Scouting which has been robust at the beginning of the year, is beginning to plateau a little bit. We are expecting a reasonably strong 2024, but it's definitely taking a while to get started. But we know that the pipeline is strong. We know it will come back. It's just taking time. And that's really challenging, given that we've been through COVID and, of course, the strikes.
We'll, of course, talk about that pipeline during our discussion here. Carla, what was the strike like for you and your colleagues?
Painful. It was really painful.
How so?
Not a lot of us were working, and the few of us that weren't, we were working below our regular pay grade. We were accepting any job that we could get.
Meaning what?
So if I was a production coordinator, if somebody offered me an assistant production coordinator position, I would take it, because that was the only game in town.
Even though under normal circumstances, that's not what you would aspire to?
That's not normally what I would do. I've done it, but I haven't done it in a while.
Gotcha. Devin, give us a sense of what the strike was like in Northern Ontario and the impact it had there.
Sure. We, by the hard numbers, we were down about 60%. We had 40 productions going down to 16. It was an interesting time because we have a lot more Canadian independent production happening in Northern Ontario. So we were able to avoid some of the, let's say, American shows that weren't coming anymore. We didn't have them anyways. So there was a little bit of a success in that. But coming out of it, it wasn't a fast return the way we had with COVID. It was almost like projects were stockpiled after COVID and we could jump into a bunch of new productions. But more recently, it's been, after the strike, a lot of, feels like kicking tires or browsing on projects and not really a lot of things landing the way that they were. So we're feeling it. There's hopefulness, as Marguerite alluded to, where we think a lot more projects are going to be looking for the rest of the year, but they haven't actually formally committed yet to being here. So that's where we have some concerns.
Rod, I wonder with U.S. productions on pause because of the strike, whether the domestic industry here in Canada filled the bill at all.
I think the domestic side filled the bill in the sense of the talent is here. The writers, directors, producers, creators, we have a strong system here. I think where it gets challenging is there's no more money in Canada just because the US studios are on pause. And I think to Marguerite's point, it raises a little bit more of an issue in the sense of there is a strike and there will be a bounce back. But I think with other macro forces at play, there may not be a bounce back that takes the same shape as we're coming out of peak TV. Everyone with a Twitter account that was making a joke could get a development deal a few years ago. I think the commissioning and the licensing has started to change. I think the online streamers and the platforms that drove peak TV had a model of growth, where as long as they kept growing their subscriber base, it's Wall Street that would value them in a very different, high way. Now they're being scrutinized to say, have you made profit? So with profit comes ways to cut costs, like maybe changing the production schedule and shortening it, or as we are well-versed, offshoring jobs. I think in Variety in March, they said that of the billions that Netflix is going to spend in the coming years, more than half is outside of North America. So I think change is coming. I think there will be a bounce back, but it may not look the same as the past.
Carla, did you expect that after the strike ended, that things would bounce back very quickly?
Yeah, we expected the same bounce back that we had after COVID, after they lifted the restrictions. And there was a stock, as Marguerite was saying, there was a stockpile of productions.
And did that happen?
It has not happened yet.
It has not happened.
No, there's been a lot of rumors, but I mean, it's just talk at this point.
Marguerite, why would things not have bounced back as quickly?
Well, I think Rod really gave some good reasons. I think there was peak TV. There was a lot of spending going on television. It was rising and rising. It was rising in a way that was pretty difficult to sustain. I think many people expected a plateau, potentially an eventual contraction. Add to that inflationary pressures, and add to that the fact that every business in some shape or form was affected by the strikes, and you have a bit of a perfect storm that is causing the studios and streamers to really look at the bottom line.
David, I want to go to you first because you've got some numbers out that are truly intriguing here. Young Canadians supported Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party 4 years ago to the tune of 34%. And that number today is not 34%, it's 25%. And that's a pretty big drop. I gather you think this is one of the biggest stories in Canadian politics today, and I wonder if you could tell us why.
Well, I think it is, Stephen. I think it's because if you had come to me or if I'd come to you a year ago and said, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party is more popular among Canadians over the age of 60 than they are among Canadians under 30, you would have said to me, David, go do another
poll. Go back in the field.
Go back in the
again.
field.
Yes.
That data is no good. Yeah. And what we're seeing consistently is the opposite is that, right? And I think that, to me, is the biggest story, because for so long, and I had to go back, I was looking even at data back into the early 2000s, like the last time a Conservative Party around an election was able to poll close to 40% among younger voters, couldn't find it, right? You have to almost probably go back to Mulrooney in '84 when anything like that happened. And so something's happening that is attracting young people to the Conservatives, but I also think largely repelling them away from the Liberals. And that, to me, is the biggest story, because Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government won their majority in 2015 because we saw this youthquake of millennials coming out and voting Liberal. And I think they saved them in the last two federal elections when the rest of the country was ready to throw Mr. Trudeau out.
Well, this program's all about theories as to why this is happening. So, Josie, why don't you come on in here and let's not have everybody do 4 or 5 reasons. Let's have everybody do one reason why you think this, you want to call it a youthquake? Maybe we're there yet, maybe not, I don't know. Let's see. Why this movement of youth, anyway, to supporting Conservatives is happening. What do you think?
Well, it's hard to narrow it down to just one condition. I think when you look at the series of factors that have impacted the lives of youth, and really when you're looking at that kind of 20 to 35 demographic, this is where their biggest changes are happening in terms of career and where they're going to work. And when you factor in the COVID-19 pandemic and how much disruption that caused, I think it's the perfect storm for some of these economic conditions we're seeing. And the youth need to have hope. They need to know that, they're going to have a stable job opportunity and they're going to be able to buy a house one day. And that's just not what's happening. And I think that really, really creates some of these economic anxieties that we're seeing today.
Tina, what are you seeing?
Well, I think I agree with that. There's a great deal of anger and anxiety among the young people today. They can't afford to rent. They can't afford to buy a house. They're having a very hard time with their grocery bills because things cost more. And, there's a big mismatch of supply and demand in our economy. Coupled with that, they're also finding that there's no clear vision that they once hoped for with Mr. Trudeau. And when you listen to Mr. Poilievre and what he's saying on social media, he comes across as somebody who is very direct, very clear, and a guy with a lot of common sense. And because they're so angry and just looking for some signs of change, they're really finding him attractive and listening to all these YouTube clips and what he's saying on social media.
We'll pick up on social media again later. People your age, what's their take on what's happening out there in terms of the economy?
Well, obviously, we're in an economic challenge right now. Everything is too expensive. Life is too, no one my age can afford anything. And so I think the biggest challenge right now for us is that we're all new grads. We're all trying to move out of home, get our own place to live, and we feel like we're back at square one. We're back at living at home, having no money to pay for groceries. And I think the biggest reason why youth are going towards Conservatives are because the Conservatives are giving them real life examples. They're giving them real life things to work on. Poilievre is doing Axe to Tax rallies, or he's bringing out so many youth and engaging them. And so they want to see that real life example of change is going to happen. And so I think that's the biggest reason why a lot of us are going towards the right, is because we're seeing things actually happen instead of just hearing about it.
Sam, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, what matters here, I think, is we need to determine what belongs in sort of a short-term category versus a long-term category, because I think it's not unusual historically for Conservatives to win these large majorities, right? As in 84, 62 or so, where there's a sort of growing anti-liberal sentiment, a malaise in the country, a desire for change. And to that extent, I think we can understand a lot of the youth support for the Conservatives as this anti-liberal sentiment, in the sense that alongside the rest of Canadians, they're sort of desiring a change in Ottawa. And whether or not that is supportive enough of the Conservatives in and of itself to stay there, in the next kind of coming electoral cycles is unclear. Because we also have to think about the long-term changes here, which is to say that while I think young people are kind of feeling the crunch of these immediate economic stresses, like inflation or housing, this is also very long-term, something that will be felt for. That has already been felt for a decade and will be felt for decades to come, this lack of economic security.
Yeah. Somebody mentioned social media a second ago, and I want to follow up with Josie on that right now, because Mr. Poilievre certainly is getting kudos for the way he uses social media to get his views out there. How has the whole rise of social media changed the way politicians interact with the public in between campaigns?
Well, I think what's really important for an opposition leader like Pierre Poilievre is that he has a lot of freedom to test messages. And I think we're seeing this kind of roll out. He's using long form videos to tell a story to Canadians that really resonates. And he's using visual descriptors to really back up the emotional sentiment that I think a lot of Canadians are feeling. A perfect example is when he was talking about encampments in Vancouver and really trying to speak to the emotions and the really strong feelings that some British Columbians have about the situation that is facing them.
What's the intention of drug decriminalization to begin with?
Drug decriminalization is a policy change that recognizes that substance use is a health issue and a public health issue, not a criminal one. It looks at the data over a century that indicates that incarceration does not really decrease substance use. It doesn't act as a deterrent. It doesn't make drugs less available. But what it does do is cause health and social harms, increases cycles of homelessness, over-incarceration of Indigenous people, Black people, and racialized people. And it doesn't really get us to the solutions that we need. So decriminalization is intended to remove some of that stigma and legal sanction to make it easier for people to access services and to be less likely to face short-term incarceration, which can cause harm and risk of overdose and can also lead to other social outcomes like losing your job and losing your housing.
Okay. Derek, any issue with any of that in terms of the goal?
Not really, no.
You're on the same page there.
So far, I think. I mean, I mean, all I would say is that we effectively, even though we don't on the books have decriminalization in Toronto. It hasn't been formally acknowledged by the federal government. I live across the street from a supervised injection site here in the city that has been in the news a fair bit over the last year because a woman was shot out front by some drug dealers that came to the area because of the site. And have spent probably 40 to 50 hours in meetings with Toronto Police Service, high-ranking people, Toronto Public Health. And, one thing that it became very clear is that here in Toronto, we have de facto criminalization in the sense that the police, our Attorney General will not prosecute cases for small possession. The police do not, try to do much about open use. They can move people along a little bit. They have some control, but I just thought it was important to point out at the outset that we do, we don't formally have decriminalization, but I would say we have a working form of it here.
But would you agree that part of the idea behind it is to treat it as a public health problem and a health problem, to decriminalize it as that kind of issue and get people healthier at the end of the day? I
agree with DJ in that I see, this crisis as a healthcare crisis, not a crisis that the police are going to get us out of.
Okay. DJ, why did the BC, this got a lot of attention when it happened not too long ago. The BC government asked for changes in its drug decriminalization plan. Why did they do that?
They were responding to public concerns and increased focus on seeing people in public. So there's been a lot of conversation about whether there has been an increase in public substance use. I'll note that the British Columbia Centre for Disease Control has released data website just this week, and that there's actually no data to indicate whether there's been an increase or a decrease in public drug consumption.
I got that. Actually, DJ, let me jump in there, because we got those numbers here, and we should share them as long as you brought it up. Sheldon, I am at the bottom of page 1, top of page 2, so let's bring this graphic up, and for those listening on podcast, I'll read what the BC Coroner Service reports. In the year 2022, there were nearly 2,400 drug deaths occurring. That's 44.5 deaths per 100,000 people. Let's go to the next year, 2023. There were more than 2,500 drug deaths occurring. That's 46.2 deaths per 100,000 people. That's a 6.2% increase. But then so far this year, we're going January to March of this year, 572 drug deaths have occurred, and that's 40.3 deaths per 100,000 people. So that's a big drop. So, okay, pick up the story, DJ, because the numbers go up, the numbers go down. What do you make of it?
In terms of the numbers going up and down, there's a number of factors we have to consider. First of all, decriminalization is meant to help people access health services. That means that those health services have to be there, and we know that we're still lacking in terms of access to even supervised consumption, methadone, other forms of treatment, including abstinence-based treatment and prescribed alternatives. The numbers, however, will not significantly decrease so long as the drug supply itself remains highly variable. Unlike alcohol or tobacco or all of the food that we eat, it's impossible to know what is in everything within the drug supply or to know how strong it is. So when we see that variability in the drug supply, we know that that means that there's an increased danger for people using it because they may not be able to take the same precautions as I would if I was drinking a glass of wine. So if we see the numbers going down now, that is certainly very good news and could be an indication that people are more able to access those health services and are more visible and able to access emergency health care when they need it. However, we do have to take into consideration that the supply will change over time as it has been for many years.
Next week on the agenda.
Come on in, come check it out. Tropical fruits in Ontario, from anything from citruses, oranges, kumquats, lemons, cedral lemons, limes, papayas, bananas. It's just an endless assortment of stuff that you can actually grow in Ontario without a greenhouse.
That's next week on the agenda.